This week focuses on Chicana Chicano theory so that we can understand the Chicana Chicano movement as a process. By the end of this week, students will be able to identify historical processes that caused a fundamental shift in the way Mexican Americans and Chicanas and Chicanos saw themselves in 20th century American society. Students will be able to examine how a political consciousness of being Mexicano in the United States gave rise to a militant ethos that became the impetus for social upheaval. Students will also be able to analyze and discuss how the Chicana Chicano movement developed and addressed specific issues that affected Mexican Americans as a historical people in the United States. And students will be able to assess historical leadership and organizations that mobilized El Movimiento, also known as the Chicana Chicano movement. In this week's reading assignment, Chicano historian Ignacio Garcia delves into the formation of a militant political consciousness among Mexican Americans, emphasizing its role in shaping a distinct identity within the broader American society. In Chicanismo, the forging of a militant ethos among Mexican Americans, Ignacio Garcia maps out a theoretical framework derived from a comprehensive historical analysis outlining four critical phases through which Mexican Americans developed a militant ethos. This ethos reflected a collective political consciousness shaped by the experiences of marginalization, resistance, and the drive for social justice. Garcia's framework traces the evolution of Mexican American identity and activism, showing how this militant ethos emerged in response to systemic inequalities. Each phase of this process was crucial in building the foundation for the Chicana Chicano movement, highlighting how the community struggles transformed into a powerful social and political force. This ethos became the ideological backbone of the movement, guiding its efforts to challenge racial and economic oppression while asserting the Mexican American identity as a distinct and influential force in American history. This ethos was not merely a sense of resistance, but a deeply rooted consciousness that emerged from the collective struggles, cultural preservation, and social political activism within the community. By navigating systemic discrimination, economic hardships, and social marginalization, Mexican Americans developed a unified sense of purpose that transcended individual grievances. Garcia argues that this militant ethos became the driving force behind the Chicana Chicano movement, or El Movimiento, which was a broad-based social movement aimed at securing civil rights, educational equity, labor rights, and political empowerment for the Chicana Chicano community. Key leaders and organizations such as Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, La Raza Unida Party, the Brown Berets, played a pivotal role in articulating and channeling this consciousness into action. The ethos fostered a sense of solidarity and urgency which united diverse Mexican American groups and communities across the U.S., helping them to collectively confront and resist systemic inequalities. The Chicana Chicano movement, thus, was not just a response to immediate social political challenges, but the culmination of decades of grassroots organizing, cultural affirmation, and political education that gave rise to a distinct and militant form of activism. The movement left a lasting legacy on American society and significantly impacted the trajectory of civil rights and social justice in the United States. According to Ignacio Garcia, the Chicano movement developed its own ideology known as Chicanismo, which became a unifying and empowering system of beliefs for the movement. The Chicano movement not only developed an ideology, but it also developed its own philosophy, which included concepts like carnalismo and nationalism. These philosophies helped shape the movement's goals, strategies, and a sense of identity. To better understand Garcia's theory, it is essential to grasp the concept of ethos. Ethos, that is, the spirit, values, and beliefs of a particular culture, era, or community that binds it together. Understanding the concept of ethos allows us to see how Garcia's theory emerges from this broader cultural and ideological framework, offering insight into the beliefs and aspirations that drive the movement. This context is crucial for interpreting the philosophy and goals that guided the actions of those involved in the movement. So when Garcia uses the term militant ethos, he refers to the body of ideas, strategies, tactics, and rationalizations that the community uses to respond to external challenges. The militant ethos helps us contextualize the movement as a social process to understand how the community rationalizes and justifies political participation. The Chicano movement developed its own ideology, known as Chicanismo, which became a unifying and empowering system of beliefs for the movement. Chicanismo embraced cultural pride, self determination, and the celebration of Mexican American heritage, often emphasizing resistance to assimilation and colonialism. Chicanismo encouraged individuals to reclaim their cultural identity and to seek social justice through collective action and political activism. Chicanismo also rejected the notion of passively accepting the status quo, instead, advocating for the empowerment of the Chicano community. Chicanismo also redefined what it meant to be both Mexican and American. Overall, it was a call for unity and resistance against oppression, emphasizing pride in cultural roots, language, and history, while also demanding recognition and respect in a society that often marginalized Mexican Americans. Chicanismo ideology shaped the goals and actions of the movement. The Chicano movement not only developed an ideology, but also its own philosophy, which included concepts like carnalismo and nationalism. These philosophies helped shape the movement's goals, strategies, and sense of identity. Carnalismo translates roughly to brotherhood or kinship, emphasizing unity, solidarity, and mutual support among Chicanas and Chicanos. It fostered a sense of collective identity and responsibility where individuals were encouraged to see each other as carnales or brothers and sisters. This philosophy promoted the idea that the strength of the movement came from the bonds within the community. It also reinforced the importance of standing together in the face of social injustice. Overall, carnalismo helped cultivate a sense of belonging and trust, motivating individuals to work for the common good of the Chicana Chicano community. Chicano philosophy, nationalism. Chicano nationalism played a central role in the movement, focusing on the need for self determination and the reclamation of cultural identity. This form of nationalism was about more than just pride in one's heritage. It was about actively resisting the forces of assimilation and oppression. Chicano nationalism sought to define a distinct Chicano identity that was neither fully Mexican nor fully American, but unique and powerful. It promoted the idea of Aztlán, a symbolic homeland representing the Chicanos' indigenous roots in the United States, therefore having a historical connection to the land. Nationalism was more than just pride in one's heritage. It reinforced a sense of peoplehood strong enough to resist the forces of assimilation and oppression. This combination of carnalismo and nationalism provided the Chicano movement with a philosophical foundation emphasizing solidarity within the community and a collective vision of cultural and political empowerment. These ideas drove the movimiento's activism and helped unify the diverse voices within it. To better understand Garcia's theory, it's important to grasp the concept of ethos. Ethos refers to the characteristic spirit, values, and beliefs of a particular culture, era, or community. It encompasses the guiding principles that shapes a group's identity and aspirations. In the context of the Chicano movement, the ethos was reflected in the shared experiences of marginalization, cultural pride, and the desire for social justice. The movement's ethos was shaped by a deep connection to Mexican American heritage, resistance to assimilation, and a commitment to community empowerment. Understanding ethos allows us to see how Garcia's theory emerges from this broader cultural and ideological framework, offering insight into the beliefs and aspirations that drive the movement. This context is crucial for interpreting the philosophy and goals that guide the actions of those involved. So, when Garcia uses the term militant ethos, he's referring to the body of ideas, strategies, tactics, and rationalizations that a community uses to respond to external challenges. In this case, a Chicano militant ethos would be the collective defensive and offensive mechanism that Mexican American community uses to combat racism, discrimination, poverty, segregation, and to define itself politically and historically. The militant ethos helps us contextualize the movement as a social process to understand how the community rationalizes and justifies political participation. Garcia argues that during the early 1960s and through the 1970s, the Chicano community's activists, reformers, and intellectuals went through several stages in their philosophy and evolution in which a political consciousness of being Mexicano in the US gave rise to a militant ethos that became the impetus for the social upheaval and aimed to synthesize the problems of Mexican American communities in terms that most could understand and relate to. Chicanismo, the forging of a militant ethos among Mexican Americans. A quick review. Starting in the 1960s and ending in the late 1970s, a large number of organizations and individuals appeared in Mexican American communities across the country, agitating for social and political change and promoting a militant self help and racial solidarity movement known as the Chicana Chicano movement. A political consciousness of being Mexicano in the US gave rise to a militant ethos that became the impetus for this social upheaval and aimed to synthesize the problems of the Mexican American community in terms that most could understand and relate to. The Chicano movement was not so much a singular process, but more of a coalescing of, of numerous philosophical and historical currents within the community that came together at a particular time and place during the 20th century. The movement did not have an exclusive political and electoral character. Chicanos fought racism and neglect in education, housing, culture, and identity. Before Ignacio Garcia sets forth the steps that Mexican American communities took to mobilize the movement, he provides historical definitions and a review of what scholars have said about this social process. Part 2. In order for Ignacio Garcia to contribute to the academic discipline of Chicana Chicano studies and position his theory within the body of literature, he provides a literature review of key books. His first review is on a book written by Rodolfo Acuña titled Occupied America, The Chicano Struggle Towards Liberation, published in 1972. Rodolfo Acuña describes the movement as a renewal of the ongoing struggle of Chicanos to liberate themselves from racism and exploitation. This renewed struggle began with the resistance movements following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the dominant institutions imposed on Mexican Americans. Garcia also critiques Rudy Acuña's book because it focuses on the national and urban Chicano struggles and, in the process, minimizes the rural movements such as the farm workers' plight and the struggle to unionize. Acuña initially used a conquest and colonization model that created structured and segmented circumstances for Chicanos throughout the Southwest that positioned them as colonized people. Later editions of his book, Occupied America, dropped the conquest and colonization model. Garcia then reviews a book by Mario Barrera titled Beyond Aztlán, Ethnic and Autonomy in Comparative Perspectives, published in 1990. Mario Barrera expands the conversation started by Rodolfo Acuña by arguing that the Chicano movement drew on the heritage of Chicano political activism, but added distinctive new elements such as youth involvement and emphasis on academic programs. Barrera posits that Chicano youth perceived a political vacuum in traditional community politics as represented by Mexican American political groups and other middle-class organizations still preaching the moderate liberal agenda. These students, argues Mario Barrera, became hypersensitive to the conditions of the barrio and saw themselves as the only ones bold enough to agitate for change. Barrera emphasizes that external conditions served as the principal catalyst for the movement: the Kennedy election, the civil rights movement, Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, the war in Vietnam, and the free speech movement in Berkeley were all stimulants to the Chicano student activism. Both Rodolfo Acuña and Mario Barrera contribute to the understanding of the Chicana Chicano movement, but they do so from different angles. Garcia's literature review helps us build a more nuanced picture of the movement by considering these different perspectives. Garcia then reviews a book by Dr. Juan Gomez Quiñones titled Chicano Politics, Reality and Promise, published in 1990. Gomez Quiñones argues that Chicanos had reached a juncture between self-determination and integration and defines the Chicano movement as the liberal phase of Chicano political history. Like Mario Barrera's book, Gomez Quiñones also argues that external events catalyzed the movement, such as the Cuban Revolution, African independence movements, and the Mexican student movement that galvanized consciousness in Chicana and Chicano students. He argues that students were responsible for developing the ideology of Chicanismo. This ideology emerged as a challenge to the dominant institutions, assumptions, politics, principles, political leaders, and organizations within and outside the community. The emphasis on dignity, self worth, pride, uniqueness, feeling of cultural rebirth, and equal economic opportunity became attractive to Mexican Americans across class, regional, and generational lines, since most had faced some form of discrimination in their lives. From this, Chicanismo came the preoccupation with the participation in community affairs, securing democratic rights and justice for the community. The student power movement provided a sense of homogeneity to a diverse community because its members identified themselves as Chicanos rather than Tejanos, Californios, and New Mexicans, and because they identified themselves with national leaders and national issues. This brought cohesion among Chicanas and Chicanos. Ignacio Garcia then turns attention to a book by Carlos Munoz, the first major figure in the movement to write about it in an autobiographical style. Munoz agrees on the question of identity and describes the movement as a social phenomenon placed in the context of politics of identity. For him, as with Dr. Juan Gomez Quiñones, students were the backbone of the drive for social change among Chicanos. Unlike Rodolfo Acuña, Carlos Munoz does not see the movement as simply another phase of the Chicano struggle for liberation. In fact, the Chicano student population signaled a departure from the past struggles because of its youthful nature, ideological tendencies, and search for identity. Working class youth, many already at universities, saw two major challenges confronting them. One was the atrocious conditions in the barrios, and the other was their isolation from the historical and cultural process. These young people decided to embark on a journey to recapture their culture, history, and primarily their identity as Chicanas and Chicanos. Like Mario Barrera, Carlos Munoz sees external factors as important in politicizing this generation of young people. These students were moved by events taking place around the world. They confronted an unjust war in which Chicanos were dying at a high rate. They were seeing liberalism as giving way to conservative politics, and this generation was dissatisfied. Garcia agrees with the scholars and their books on many aspects of the Chicano movement, but he also identifies a critical gap in their analysis: the movement's lack of synthesis. While the scholars acknowledge the movement's roots in a search for identity and collective resistance against racism and exploitation, Garcia argues that the Chicano movement was more than just a quest for identity or a collective outburst of anxiety. Garcia asserts that the movement lacked a comprehensive synthesis, meaning it struggled to integrate its various components, cultural, political, and social, into a unified strategy or ideology. While identity politics and the assertion of Chicano heritage were central to the movement, Garcia believes that focusing on identity alone oversimplifies the movement's broader goals and complexities. In his view, the movement was more than merely reclaiming cultural heritage. It was about addressing systemic issues such as economic inequality, political disenfranchisement, and social justice on multiple fronts. By identifying this lack of synthesis, Garcia seeks to broaden the academic discussion on the Chicano movement. He positions it not just as a moment of cultural awakening, but as a multifaceted struggle that aimed to transform society in tangible ways. According to Garcia, the movement was driven by a deeper pursuit of structural change, seeking to address the roots and causes of inequality rather than merely responding to the systems of oppression. This critique opens up space for further analysis of the movement's success and limitations. Garcia challenges the narrative that reduces the Chicano movement to an identity-based rebellion, advocating instead for a more holistic understanding that considers its broader social and political aims. This perspective encourages scholars to explore how the movement could have benefited from greater ideological cohesion and strategy, which might have led to more enduring structural changes, and most importantly, it allows him to position his theory of the militant ethos. Garcia contends the development of a Chicano militant ethos requires that intellectuals, politicians, activists, and other influential individuals within a community assess their historical importance, recognizing or deciding on their class status, promoting their cultural roots, and to organize a political agenda. To explain how a Chicano militant ethos guided the movement between the 1960s and 1970s, Garcia identifies four phases that contribute to a clear picture of what occurred among the barrios elite, the working class, and La Raza artists and culturalists. Accordingly, in the first phase, Mexican American intellectuals, politicians, students, and others came to believe that the liberal agenda, which had been seen as a solution to the community's problem, was morally corrupt and a failure. According to Ignacio Garcia, this generation rejected the liberal agenda. By liberal agenda, Garcia means the traditional manner by which immigrants and minorities were supposed to integrate into the American mainstream. This would include education, good citizenship, patriotism, alliance with liberal groups, faith in government, and cultural assimilation. The liberal agenda, like acculturation, de-Mexicanized Mexicans and failed to Americanize them. The second phase, according to Garcia, Mexican American activists saw a need to reinterpret the past. They knew that Mexican Americans could overcome their powerlessness only if they saw themselves as historical people with heroes, legends, triumphs, and legacies. Chicano historians discovered old heroes and reinterpret old events through a new nationalist framework that made Mexican Americans active participants in history. This reinterpretation led Mexican Americans to discard the stereotypes of the lazy, passive, mañana-oriented Mexicano and replace them with the proud, historically rich Chicana Chicano who was ready to fight for his and her community. Scholars, writers, dramatists, poets, and essayists found new protagonists in the forgotten history. They discovered revolutionists, journalists, lawyers, union organizers, and others who had fought against the overwhelming Anglo American onslaught. This reinterpretation also allowed Mexican Americans to shift the blame for many of the barrios problems from themselves to American society. Now they saw poverty, alienation, the political powerlessness because of the US conquest of the Southwest and subsequent colonization, segregation, and racism. History, once used to perpetuate stereotypes and rationalize Mexican American backwardness, became a weapon for liberation. It also allowed for the growth of an academic as well as an organic or homegrown Chicano intellectual elite that sought to give meaning to the Mexican American experience. In the third phase, Chicana, Chicano activists, intellectuals, and artists led to affirm a rediscovered pride in their racial and class status and their sense of peoplehood. They emphasized their indigenous past and glorified the ancient civilizations of Mexico and South America. This connection to racial origins gave Mexican Americans historiosity. It became okay to be brown. Prietos, those with brown complexions, were beautiful too. By accentuating their class status, Chicano activists and their adherents could legitimize and at times romanticize the lives of those who lived in the barrio. Mexican Americans, particularly the youth, did not have to be embarrassed by the music they heard, the food they ate, the curanderas who cured their illnesses, or their homegrown philosophies shared across countless kitchen tables. This affirmation of race and class brought about a sense of solidarity with third world movements for liberation and united Chicanas and Chicanos with a worldwide revolution against oppression. It also spurred a renaissance of Chicano literature, theater, and art. Artists and writers now took to the barrios as their setting for their work and their working people, or their indigenous ancestors as the protagonists. This attempt by earlier artists to integrate the mainstream ceased among many of the new and some of the works into old artists of the barrios. The search began for a uniquely Chicano literature, theater, and art. In the fourth phase of the militant ethos, Chicano activists engaged in oppositional politics. They developed platforms, manifestos, and tactics that best represented an oppositional strategy to the American mainstream. Rather than simply make things bearable for Mexican Americans, Chicano activists sought to empower their community to free it from Anglo American politicians, nativists, educational curriculums, and cultural stereotypes. By engaging in oppositional politics, Chicano activists could emphasize the Mexicanness of the community and steer it away from integration into American society. To this end, they created their political party, developed nationalist and quasi socialist platforms, and manipulated local government agencies to be pro Chicano and anti Anglo. Chicano activists sought to question fundamentally the goodness of American society and undo the effects of years of segregation, discrimination, poverty, and political powerlessness. These political ideals were developed within a new framework that saw Mexican Americans as a historically and culturally rich community seeking to liberate itself from Anglo American racism. Grassroots politics that sought to active participation by people in the barrio became the norm. According to Chicano historian Ignacio Garcia, the four-phase view of the movement offers a new synthesis by which to study this activist period in the life of the Mexican American community. As compared with a narrative, or even a class-based analysis, this synthesis best captures the interclass, intergenerational, and intergender coalescing that took place to form the militant ethos. Although Garcia mostly focuses on men such as authors, activists, leaders of organizations, Chicanas played an equal and important role in the Chicano movement. Therefore, I emphasize in the politics of opposition and in the front lines of direct action, Chicanas are to play the biggest part, from the lettuce fields of Southern California and the urban jungles of Colorado to the political offices of La Raza Unida Party in Texas. Chicanas remained a political presence throughout the movimiento, period. To fill the void of Chicana activism that Ignacio Garcia creates in his study, we will focus on Chicana feminist thought and gender politics next week. This concludes this week's PowerPoint presentation.